The parable of the Good Samaritan has always fascinated me because there are so many embedded truths in it, insights that seem to reveal us almost like a mirror can reveal the blemishes in our face or the hair that's a little bit crazy. It seems like every time you kind of glance at it this way or in this direction, the parable of the Good Samaritan unearths something else inside of us, something else that we can respond to, something else that we can learn from. I mean, and just going through it's powerful enough. I mean, it's Luke chapter 10, verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, typically, especially in Mark or in Matthew's gospel, typically when the word teacher is used, it's not gonna be a great interaction. It's just kind of like a gospel rule of thumb. Is it that way every time? No. But this is one of those times where it gets a little awkward. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? That's actually a common question that would be asked of a rabbi. Of course, in this setting, what Jesus answers and ultimately how this expert in the law responds will be two collision courses, if you will, of what it means to be a faithful follower of Yahweh. Because on one level, you see it as being purely Israel. And on another level, you see Jesus saying, be more reckless. Jesus says in verse 26, well, what is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? That's fascinating. He says, if you're an expert in the law and you're asking me a question that is about the law, then what is it that you're reading that you need to come to me and get instruction for? He then answers his own question as such. He answered, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength and with all of your mind. That's the first and greatest commandment that Jesus says in the other Gospels. But that's also the great Shema, Deuteronomy 6. And then he says this, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you've answered correctly. Like, you answered your own question and you're right. He says, do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. I think that's a fascinating detail that Luke puts in there. He wanted to justify himself publicly, to be able to demonstrate that he indeed has fulfilled the first and the second greatest commandments. Now, before we get, on our, before we start to accuse, let's be honest. We do some incredible things when it comes to justifying ourselves, of finding ways to allow deviations from God's will to be something that we convince ourselves and others that what we have done is exactly God's will, even though it's the opposite. In other words, we're a lot like this expert in the law. We're human. Adam and Eve wanted to justify themselves for what they did. So Adam even says, it's the woman that you gave me. God, justifying ourselves is in the very DNA of fallen humanity. He wanted to justify himself, verse 29. So he asked Jesus, and so who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? The Israelite? Because I treat them super well. And then Jesus tells a parable that takes this to a whole different level. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. And the people of the audience would have been like, yep, we know what you're talking about. That road, not a good road. Somehow this guy went there and nobody had told him. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. A priest? But he's supposed to be one of the holy ones. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. A Levite? It's from his lineage that priests come. Last week, in our video, we talked about inconvenience. Neither of them were willing to be inconvenienced. But a Samaritan, that would have stung. the people in the audience, especially the expert in the law, because the expert in the law is looking for a way to justify himself as pure people of God. And the Samaritans in the mind of the Jews were impure. They had intermarried during their exile with the Assyrians. They were half-breeds, was the negative, racist name that they were called. And Jesus puts this person as the hero of the story. A Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him and was willing to be inconvenienced. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. In other words, spending a lot of money just on that personal interaction, because oil and wine would not have been cheap. Then he put the man on his own donkey that he was riding on this dangerous road, and instead walked. And he brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, which was not a little amount of money, and gave them to the innkeeper. And this is what he says: "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any expenses you may have." In other words, if this doesn't cover the bill, I will make sure that I cover the bill. Let me just stop here for a minute and say this. This is not how Samaritans were viewed in Jesus' time. It'd be comparable to us, referring to the opposite political party that you are and saying, they're the hero in the story. Then Jesus, though, summarizes the parable with a piercing question. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Jesus asks a question of the teacher of the law. And this is what I wanted to get to. This is the point of our interaction today. Listen to what the expert in the law says. The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." He could not even say the name Samaritan. He hated the Samaritan with so much in him that he could not say the name. And one of the things I found in my own heart, one of the things I have found in my own story, is that there are wounds so deep that I not only want to justify myself for how I interact with those wounds, but sometimes the wounds go so deep that whenever it confronts me, the wound, with the enemy, I can't even say their name. Because of the pain they've inflicted on me is so intense, I have a hard time even saying their name. And here is the point of this parable. Yes, sure, be inconvenienced. But also look into the mirror of your soul and ask yourself the question: is there an enemy in my story who has wounded me to such a level that I cannot even say their name? That I will them out of existence? That I long for them to cease to be a part of this world and my story? Let me just say this. What Jesus is pointing out in this parable, and what I'm challenging you with in this video, is this. It's that name, that wound, where you must allow grace to do its greatest work. For the problem with the expert in the law is that grace would not extend beyond him to his enemies. My challenge for you this week is this. Find the name that you do not want to say because of the pain that it conjures. And not only say the name, but invite Jesus and his grace to come into that space so that you can be healed, and hopefully so too can be the person that holds that name. I love you guys. Have a good week.